Okay, so my name's Katherine Harloe and I'm a professor in the School of Advanced Study in the University of London, and I'm the director of the Institute of Classical Studies. Yeah, it's not an obvious connection for me in that my primary discipline is classics. So most of my career I've been teaching the ancient Greeks and the Romans, and that's an element of my research as well. But I think there were two things that led me to the 18th century. One was as a student studying German idealist philosophy. That's what led me to Germany, and being very confused by it and wanting to understand the intellectual and cultural context from which it came. I think another big moment thinking back was when I was doing my PhD, which was in philosophy. The Enlightenment Gallery opened in the British Museum back in 2003, and I went to some lectures by the then director of the British Museum, Neil MacGregor, who then came to Germany and was director of the Humboldt Forum for a while. And those lectures and the gallery and its layout really prompted my interest in the kind of scenes of knowledge of the Enlightenment. And I could see that classics also played a big role. And that's what really got me hooked on it as a field of research. A huge question, of course, and one to which I don't think there's just one answer. I've noticed that my students use Enlightenment in a kind of trans-historical way. So they'll talk about the Greek Enlightenment of the 5th century BCE, 6th century BCE. This is kind of unfashionable now. It's frowned upon because it's thought that there's a real sense of exceptionalism there. And I guess that's a kind of metaphor of a transference from the Enlightenment, the 18th century. Critique is one element of it. I do think that what becomes a secularization process is also quite important to notions of the Enlightenment. But I think one of the things that research has been teaching us and trying to find out is how, I suppose, especially also in this context, in the context we're in Halle, actually secularization isn't the right way to think about what was going on in the 18th century, and ways in which certain religious conceptions still played a very, very important role in Enlightenment thought. I guess the other thing is, was there the Enlightenment or were there multiple Enlightenments? And of course, there have been big debates about that and how the Enlightenment differs in different national contexts. But I think that as a classicist, one of the contributions I have to make is thinking actually about the Republic of Letters as a space where international communication happened. And I think thinking about the ways in which people in different places were connected up is something that has to moderate this view of very different national enlightenments. It's interesting, it's been interesting being here in Halle and being part of a Centre for Enlightenment Research, because I suppose there's a lot of debate, there has been across the 20th century, hasn't there, about the topic of Enlightenment, the topicality, the question of whether the Enlightenment lived up to its promises of, universalism and human rights and so on. Those debates continue now, and I think in the last 20 years, and even in the last 4 or 5 years, they've taken new turns as people have pointed more to the underbelly of the Enlightenment, if you like. There's a lot of debate around how Britain comes to terms with its imperial history and how we think about that. And of course, empire was a huge feature of 18th century Britain. That's another dimension to the Enlightenment. I don't think it means that we ditch the notion. And I think some of the critiques are in a way holding Enlightenment thought and philosophy to account for principles that were articulated and not fully realised. So it continues to be topical, but continues to be contested. Well, I guess one set of opportunities are that it is an actors category. People in the 18th century do talk about contributing to Enlightenment, and I guess that kind of project of improvement on various levels, whether it's educational, social, political, It's a necessary term in order to grasp the historical understanding of actors in the period, I think. Challenges, that was the other side of the question. Enlightenment is definitely one of those terms that is used by different people in different ways, and I think that's always quite dangerous. And this is something I think that my students have also struggled with. It's a term that has been handed to them and they think they know what it means. It gets used as a shortcut. But of course there's something much, much more complicated going on. And so I think there is the danger that people think they know what they're talking about but turn out to be talking about quite different things. It's not a term I use very much in my own work, but I guess that's partly because I'm invested in exploring notions of classicism as they emerge in the later 18th and 19th century, and classics and classicism are similarly contestable and difficult concepts. But of course, many intellectual historical concepts are. Well, I guess one of the fun things about being in Halle this month was being at the conference last week on German classics. And it became apparent, I think, that the term Klassiker in German and classics in English and classique in French don't really map onto each other completely. There is a conversation going on between the different vernaculars about this term, which derives from Latin, but actually they do end up being used and shaped in different ways. And likewise, I think, Lumière is actually different from Aufklärung. I think of Aufklärung as being more of an attempt, I guess, to reconcile religious thought with certain notions of improvement and modernity. Whereas I would think about Lumière and the kind of project of the Lumière as moving us further away from religion. This is a slightly naughty answer, but I'm not an adherent to the idea that the concept of enlightenment can be clarified in that manner. I think one of the interesting things about the kinds of concepts that arise in intellectual and cultural history is that they contain incoherences and tensions. Maybe I'm with Nietzsche on this, the idea that only what has no history can be defined. I'm not sure that conceptual clarification can really be our goal in intellectual history. I think there's a kind of clarification which comes from exploring and understanding complexity. But that's different from the kind of clarification that philosophers aim at. And I think that, thinking back to my answer to the first question, where I said it was partly my study of philosophy and my study of German idealism that then led me into the 18th century, I think that's what also led me to be a historian rather than a philosopher in the end, although I did my doctoral research in philosophy, because I think there's a kind of project of clarification in philosophy which actually doesn't work in intellectual history.